Officer Derek Thompson had always been known for his rough demeanor. He had been with the police force for over a decade, and while he was good at his job, he often came across as harsh and unapproachable. His reputation for being quick-tempered and stubborn had earned him both respect and fear within the police department. But there was something else about him aside that many didn't see. Thompson had always carried certain biases, ones that shaped the way he saw the world around him. The same biases that had caused tension between him and some of the community members he was sworn to protect. On this particular night, Thompson was called in for a routine patrol shift. It was late, the streets were quiet, and the city seemed to sleep beneath the light of the moon. He was used to the calm of late-night patrols, the stillness that allowed him to think or let his mind wander. But that night, the silence didn't last long. Thompson was alerted to a call about a possible drug-related activity in a nearby neighborhood. It wasn't unusual. It was a high-crime area, and he'd been there many times before. He drove through the streets, scanning the surroundings, when he saw the car. It was parked on the side of the road, and the driver seemed to be sitting still. Thompson's instincts kicked in. He parked his patrol car a little distance away and grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, I'm on a traffic stop." Requesting backup, he muttered, his voice barely audible above the engine's hum. His hand rested on the grip of his firearm as he approached the car cautiously. The window was rolled down slightly, and Thompson could make out the figure of a woman sitting inside, her face mostly obscured by the shadows of the night. He couldn't see much else, just the outline of her in the driver's seat. He approached her side, keeping his voice steady. "Ma'am, please step out of the vehicle," Thompson ordered, his tone firm. The woman hesitated, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Step out of the car now," Thompson repeated, his hand moving toward his weapon. There was something in her eyes, something that made him nervous, something that didn't sit right. He had seen too many situations go wrong too quickly. His training kicked in. The situation was escalating faster than he had anticipated. But what Thompson didn't know was that the woman, Evelyn Lawson, wasn't what she seemed. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't even a suspect. Evelyn was simply lost, trying to find her way home after an evening out. She had no idea what was happening until the officer's voice snapped her out of her confusion. She was a bright, hard-working young woman, an innocent who had never been in trouble with the law. But her fate had taken a sharp turn, and she had no idea what was about to unfold. In the seconds that followed, everything changed. The fear in Evelyn's eyes became more apparent. She saw the officer's hand on his gun and the stern look on his face. In her panic, she tried to explain, but the words were lost in the chaos. Thompson's mind raced, his training telling him to act quickly, to secure the situation before things got out of hand. He wasn't thinking clearly. A flash of movement, a quick step toward the car. Thompson's finger tightened on the trigger before he even realized what had happened. A single shot rang out into the night. Everything slowed down for a moment as the world seemed to freeze. Evelyn's body jerked violently in the seat, and the look of confusion and fear in her eyes was replaced by shock. Thompson stood there, motionless for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The adrenaline coursed through him, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He had done it. He had fired his weapon, and he had just hit someone. He quickly realized that it wasn't just anyone, it was Evelyn Lawson, the daughter of a powerful federal judge. For a moment, Thompson's world seemed to collapse around him. He had made a split-second decision that would change everything. He never meant to hurt anyone, let alone someone so innocent, but now, in the blink of an eye, he had turned a routine night shift into a tragic accident. He rushed to her side, calling for backup over his radio, but the words felt hollow. Evelyn was slumped in her seat, blood beginning to pool around her. Panic set in as Thompson fumbled with his hands, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to do something, anything, to undo the damage he had caused. But it was too late. The reality of the situation hit him like a wave. The night that started so quietly, so routine, had now become a nightmare. Thompson's life would never be the same again. The mistake he had made was inexcusable, but it was a mistake one born out of fear, out of judgment, and out of his deep-seated biases. Evelyn was rushed to the hospital, and Thompson's world began to crumble. He had never imagined that this could happen. He had never thought that something so catastrophic could unfold so quickly, but it did. And it was his fault. As Evelyn's condition worsened in the hospital, her family was notified, and the story of the shooting quickly spread. News outlets picked up the story, and the public's reaction was swift. It wasn't just another police shooting, it was a tragedy. A young woman, a daughter, a sister, a friend shot by an officer who had made a terrible error in judgment. But the real shock came when the media uncovered the connection. Evelyn Lawson was not just any victim, she was the daughter of Judge Lawrence Lawson, a respected federal judge known for his strong stance on justice and his reputation for fairness. The moment that detail was revealed, the situation escalated from a tragic accident to something much larger. The public's outrage grew. People demanded justice. They wanted answers. Why had Thompson made such a rash decision? Why had he assumed the worst of an innocent woman? And most importantly, why did the system allow officers with prejudices to continue serving, despite their actions? As Evelyn's condition remained critical, the media spotlight on Officer Thompson grew more intense. And soon, the story would take a turn that no one could have predicted. The once comfortable world that Thompson had known was collapsing, and soon, he would face the consequences of his actions, consequences that would echo through the entire nation. The news of the shooting spread like wildfire through the community. For hours, the media reports focused on the tragic event. Evelyn Lawson, the daughter of Judge Lawrence Lawson, had been shot by a police officer during a routine traffic stop. The public was stunned. The story was everywhere on television, social media, and in the newspapers. The images of Evelyn's family, especially her distraught father, Judge Lawrence Lawson, were plastered on every screen. The nation was watching, and everyone was asking the same question: how could this happen? Evelyn was still in critical condition at the hospital, her life hanging by a thread. Doctors worked tirelessly to save her, but the wound was severe, and the situation was dire. Judge Lawson, a figure known for his unshakable demeanor and commitment to justice, found himself powerless in the face of the tragic reality. His daughter, the young woman he had raised with love and care, was fighting for her life because of one man's mistake. And that man was a police officer, a man sworn to protect and serve, but who had failed to do so in the most unimaginable way. Judge Lawson's emotions were a mix of anger, grief, and disbelief. He paced the hospital hallway, not knowing what to do. This was his daughter, the one person he had tried to protect above all else, and now her life was at risk because of a police officer's rash decision. His mind raced through the possibilities. What had led to this? What could have made Officer Derek Thompson shoot Evelyn, someone who was completely innocent? The question consumed him. While Evelyn fought for her life, the investigation into the incident was already underway. It was clear that the situation wasn't as simple as it might have seemed at first. Officer Thompson had fired his weapon, and Evelyn had been injured. But there were so many questions. Why had Thompson been so quick to pull the trigger? Why hadn't he taken a moment to assess the situation more carefully? And why had his biases clouded his judgment? The internal investigation began, but it was already clear that Thompson had a history of aggressive behavior. He had been involved in previous incidents that had raised eyebrows, but nothing had ever come of them. Now, with Evelyn fighting for her life and the media breathing down their necks, the department had no choice but to take the investigation seriously. The investigation team, however, wasn't as unbiased as it should have been. Some officers still sympathized with Thompson, seeing him as a fellow cop who had made a tragic mistake. They argued that his actions were a result of the high-stress nature of his job. But others, including some senior members of the force, knew that this wasn't just a mistake, it was something much deeper. They knew that Thompson had shown signs of racism and aggression in the past, and now they had to confront the ugly truth that these issues had contributed to the events that had led to Evelyn's shooting. As the investigation continued, more details emerged. Officer Thompson had a history of complaints from community members about his treatment of people of color. He was known for his quick temper and his tendency to escalate situations. People who had encountered him on the job described him as someone who was more likely to use force than to de-escalate. The more they dug, the clearer it became, Thompson wasn't just an officer who made a mistake, he was a product of a broken system, one that allowed officers like him to continue serving despite their deep-rooted issues. Meanwhile, the community was outraged. Protests broke out across the city, with people demanding justice for Evelyn. Activists, local leaders, and concerned citizens took to the streets, calling for accountability. They demanded that the police department address the systemic racism that had led to this tragedy. They also demanded that Thompson be held responsible for his actions. The public outrage was deafening, and it seemed like every day brought more people out to voice their anger. As the protests grew larger, the focus shifted from the police officers' individual actions to the broader issue of police brutality. People began to question the system as a whole, asking why incidents like this continued to happen, why certain officers were able to continue their dangerous behavior without consequence. The case wasn't just about one officer, it was about a culture within law enforcement that allowed racism and violence to persist. Judge Lawson, too, was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. His grief over his daughter's condition was overwhelming, but there was more at play here than just personal loss. The public pressure was mounting, and the case had become something much larger than anyone could have predicted. It was no longer just about Evelyn, it was about a broken system that needed to change. The media continued to cover every aspect of the investigation, focusing on the racial tensions that had been exposed. The story spread beyond the local community, catching the attention of national news outlets. People across the country were talking about the case, and many saw it as a turning point in the conversation about race and policing in America. As the story gained traction, it became clear that the outcome of this case would have far-reaching consequences. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Officer Thompson maintained that his actions were an accident. His defense lawyer argued that the shooting was a tragic mistake, one that had occurred in the heat of the moment. But the public wasn't buying it. The more they learned about Thompson's history, the more they saw the accident for what it really was, a result of his own biases and prejudices. At the hospital, Evelyn's condition began to stabilize, but she was still far from out of danger. She remained unconscious, and her family could only wait, praying for a miracle. Judge Lawson stayed by her side, trying to hold it together for her sake. He knew that the road to recovery would be long for Evelyn, but he also knew that the road to justice would be even longer. As the days passed, the weight of the situation began to settle in. Evelyn's story had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. Her family, especially her father, was now at the center of a storm that no one could have predicted. Judge Lawson, once a figure of unwavering authority, now found himself in the position of fighting for his daughter's life and, in a way, fighting for a more just system. The stakes had never been higher. The world was watching, and both the future of Evelyn's recovery and the fate of Officer Thompson hung in the balance. The courtroom was packed with people, all eager to witness the trial that had captivated the nation. Evelyn Lawson's shooting had become more than just a local tragedy, it was now a symbol of a larger issue, one that seemed to plague the justice system at its core. The media had been covering every angle of the case, and the tension in the air was palpable. As the doors to the courtroom opened, all eyes turned to the figure standing at the defendant's table, Officer Derek Thompson. Thompson looked different now than he had when he first entered the scene. Gone was the confident, well-put-together cop everyone had known. In his place stood a man facing the consequences of his actions, a man who was now realizing the enormity of the situation. His face, once full of arrogance, was now etched with fear and uncertainty. His defense lawyer, a well-known attorney specializing in police misconduct cases, stood by his side, preparing for the fight of his life. The trial had already been delayed for weeks, but now, it was time for the courtroom drama to begin. Judge Lawrence Lawson, Evelyn's father, had recused himself from the case to avoid any appearance of bias, but his presence loomed over the proceedings. The atmosphere was tense, not just because of the gravity of the case but also because of the emotions that were running high. The courtroom was divided, with some people supporting Thompson, believing that it had been a tragic mistake, and others demanding justice for Evelyn. The trial started with opening statements. The prosecutor, a woman known for her fierce pursuit of justice, stood before the jury. She spoke with conviction, her voice steady as she detailed the events leading up to Evelyn's shooting. She painted a vivid picture of the night, how Officer Thompson had approached Evelyn's car with a sense of fear and aggression, how he had been quick to escalate the situation, and how, in a moment of panic, he had pulled the trigger, not once but with enough force to nearly take a life. The evidence is clear, the prosecutor said, looking directly at the jury. This was not an accident. This was a result of a pattern of behavior, a history of racial bias, and a lack of judgment. Officer Thompson's actions were reckless and dangerous, and the consequences of those actions have affected a family forever. The prosecutor's words hit the room hard. Evelyn's family, sitting in the front row, could feel the weight of every word. Her mother, still visibly shaken from the events, wiped away tears as the prosecutor spoke. Judge Lawson, though calm on the outside, clenched his fists tightly, the anger in his eyes barely contained. Thompson's defense lawyer, a man with years of experience in defending officers, was quick to respond. He argued that the situation had been chaotic and that Thompson's actions had been a result of split-second decisions made in a high-stress environment. He painted Thompson as a man who had been caught in an unexpected situation, someone who had made a mistake, but a mistake that should not define his entire career. Officer Thompson has served this community for years. He has put his life on the line countless times to protect others. This was a tragic accident, one that no one could have predicted. My client regrets what happened deeply, but he should not be punished for a mistake made in the heat of the moment, the defense attorney said, his voice calm and measured. But the jury was not so easily swayed. The evidence against Thompson was overwhelming. The recordings from his body camera, which had been released to the public, showed his quick decision to pull the trigger without assessing the situation fully. The tapes showed his interactions with Evelyn, who had been nothing but cooperative. There was no justification for his actions, no reason for him to have feared for his life in the way that he claimed. As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom grew. The prosecution called witnesses who spoke to Thompson's previous conduct, revealing a history of complaints against him from people who had encountered him on the job. Several individuals testified about Thompson's aggressive behavior during traffic stops, his tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily, and his history of racial bias, which had been noted by others in the force but had never been addressed. One of the most powerful moments came when a local activist took the stand. She described the frustration of communities that had dealt with officers like Thompson for years, men who had the power to take lives with no consequence. This isn't just about one officer, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. This is about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Officer Thompson may have pulled the trigger, but the system is what gave him the power to do so. And the system is what has to change. The courtroom was silent after her testimony. Judge Lawson sat with his head bowed, listening to the words that cut through the air like a knife. He knew the truth of what she was saying. This wasn't just about what happened to his daughter, it was about a larger issue that needed to be addressed. As the trial progressed, Evelyn's father became more vocal, though not in the way most might expect. Instead of speaking out directly in the courtroom, Judge Lawson took to social media, posting impassioned messages calling for justice. His words resonated with the public, who had already begun to rally behind his family's fight for accountability. The judge's statements were a call to action, a plea for change in a system that had allowed people like Thompson to continue serving, even when they had clearly shown their inability to protect and serve. By the end of the week, the courtroom drama had reached its peak. The prosecutor delivered a powerful closing argument, stating that this was not just about Evelyn Lawson's shooting but about every incident of police misconduct that had gone unpunished. This case is a reflection of the broader issues in law enforcement. We cannot allow officers to hide behind excuses, behind fear, behind bad training. We must hold them accountable. For Evelyn. For every victim. The defense's closing argument tried to humanize Thompson, focusing on his previous good deeds and his regret over the incident. But it was clear that the jury had already made up their minds. The pattern of behavior, the evidence of Thompson's bias, and the tragic consequences of his actions were impossible to ignore. As the judge gave the final instructions to the jury, the room held its breath. The trial was nearing its conclusion, and soon, the jury would have to decide whether Officer Thompson would be held accountable for what had happened, or if he would be allowed to walk away with minimal consequences. Outside the courtroom, the protests continued, growing in number and intensity. People were demanding change, not just for Evelyn but for everyone who had been wronged by a system that had failed them. And as the verdict loomed, it seemed that the fight for justice was far from over. And the press was ready to cover what would be a pivotal moment in the trial. The room was quiet, with everyone holding their breath, waiting for the decision that would shape not only Officer Derek Thompson's life but also the future of the larger conversation about police accountability. Judge Edward Nolan entered the courtroom, and everyone stood in respect. He took his seat, and the proceedings began. Officer Thompson sat at the defendant's table, his once confident posture now slumped in resignation. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through his notes nervously. The weight of the situation was heavy in the air. Everyone knew what was at stake not just for Thompson but for the whole justice system. In the gallery, Evelyn's family was present, their faces a mix of exhaustion, anxiety, and hope. Her mother, still devastated by the tragedy, clung to her husband's side, her hands trembling. Judge Lawrence Lawson sat next to her, his expression unreadable. He had been through so much, but today was the day that would define whether the justice system would hold an officer accountable for his actions or whether he would once again escape with little consequence. It was clear that the case had become personal for him. He had to fight not only for his daughter but also for the trust in the legal system he had spent his life upholding. The defense and prosecution had both rested their cases, and now, the jury would return to deliberate. The question on everyone's mind was whether Officer Thompson's actions, his rash decision to shoot Evelyn, would be seen as a product of a broken system, or whether the system would allow him to walk away unpunished. The jury was tasked with determining whether Thompson was guilty of manslaughter, reckless endangerment, or even a more severe charge. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge called for a short recess while the jury deliberated. Outside the courtroom, protests continued to build, with demonstrators rallying for justice for Evelyn Lawson. The streets around the courthouse were lined with people holding signs, chanting for accountability. The city was alive with anger and hope, as it felt like the eyes of the entire nation were watching. Would Officer Thompson be held responsible for his actions? Or would the powerful institution that protected him for so long continue to shield him? As the jury went into deliberations, Evelyn's condition remained critical. She had made it through the first few weeks, and her family was cautiously optimistic, but they knew she had a long recovery ahead of her. She had not been able to speak yet, and her family was still uncertain of the full extent of her injuries. Judge Lawson spent every moment at her side, trying to stay strong for his daughter, but the emotional toll of the trial had drained him. He knew that, no matter the verdict, nothing could erase the pain Evelyn had endured. But he also knew that justice was essential, not just for his daughter but for everyone who had been affected by the actions of rogue officers like Thompson. Inside the courtroom, the jury deliberated for hours, and with each passing minute, the weight of the situation became more apparent. Thompson sat in his chair, looking down at his hands. He had spent years behind the bench, but now, everything he had built seemed to be falling apart. He was a man caught between two worlds: his history as an officer, where he had been taught to believe in the system, and the cold reality that his actions had caused irreparable harm to an innocent woman and her family. As he sat in silence, the thought that he could lose everything: his career, his freedom, loomed over him. He had never truly considered that his career could end like this, that his legacy could be tainted forever by one impulsive mistake. After what seemed like an eternity, the jury finally returned to the courtroom. The room fell silent as the foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hands. Judge Nolan nodded, signaling him to proceed. The foreman cleared his throat, and with a slow, deliberate voice, he began reading the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Derek Thompson, guilty of manslaughter in the second degree." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom. Evelyn's family exchanged looks of disbelief and relief. The charge of manslaughter was a significant one, but it was not as severe as they had hoped for. Still, it was a conviction, a step toward justice, but not the full justice they had envisioned. It was a moment of victory, but also one that came with an understanding that this was not a perfect resolution. There was a sense of closure, but it was mixed with the realization that no amount of punishment could undo the damage Thompson had caused. Thompson, for his part, seemed to slump even further in his seat, his face pale. The guilty verdict was not the outcome he had expected. His defense team had hoped for a lighter sentence, perhaps even a plea deal that would allow him to avoid prison time. But the jury had spoken, and there was no going back. The reality of his actions had caught up with him, and now, he would have to face the consequences of his decisions. Judge Nolan's voice broke through the silence, instructing the jury to return tomorrow for sentencing. The judge made it clear that while Thompson's conviction was significant, the sentencing would be another important step in determining the justice served. As the courtroom emptied, the tension that had built for weeks began to give way to a quiet, uneasy sense of resolution. Evelyn's family stood together, knowing that the road to healing for them was far from over. The protests outside the courthouse continued into the night, with people celebrating the conviction while also demanding more. It was clear that the fight for justice was far from finished. Officer Thompson's conviction might have been a victory, but it was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would continue to expose the flaws in the system and push for change on a broader scale. For Evelyn's family, the verdict was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served in part, but the scars from the shooting would never fully heal. As the evening drew to a close, the city was left to reflect on the trial, the conviction, and what it meant for the future. For Evelyn, for her family, and for the community, the verdict was a step forward, but there was still much work to be done. The journey toward full justice and healing had only just begun. This version of Part 4 captures the emotion. The days following the verdict were filled with a mixture of emotions. The city was divided, as expected. Some celebrated the conviction, seeing it as a small victory in the fight for justice. Others, however, felt that it was not enough, that it didn't fully address the systemic issues that had led to the shooting in the first place. But for Evelyn's family, it was a time of both relief and uncertainty. The conviction was a step forward, but it was not the end of the road. Evelyn Lawson, though still physically recovering from the wounds she had suffered, began to emerge from the haze of pain that had enveloped her for weeks. She had not been able to speak for a long time, but her doctors had confirmed that she was making progress. Her body, though bruised and scarred, was slowly healing. But her mind was a different matter. She had to process what had happened to her, not just the shooting, but the entire experience of seeing her life nearly taken by someone she had never met, someone who had sworn to protect her. As Evelyn sat in her hospital room, her parents by her side, the weight of the situation was not lost on them. They had fought hard for justice, but they also knew that Evelyn's road to recovery physically and emotionally would be long. She had been through so much. The trauma she had endured, the fear of her own death, and the anger she felt toward the system that allowed someone like Officer Thompson to carry a weapon and make such a tragic mistake, it was all a lot for anyone to carry. Judge Lawson, who had been so focused on the courtroom battle, now found himself focusing on his daughter. The fight for justice had been important, but now, the fight for Evelyn's peace of mind was even more pressing. He spent hours by her side, talking to her softly, trying to reassure her that everything would be okay. But as a father, he could see that she was not the same person who had walked out of the house weeks ago. The world had changed for her, and she had changed with it. "I'm proud of you, Evelyn," Judge Lawson said one evening, sitting beside her hospital bed. "You've shown strength beyond anything I could have imagined. We'll get through this together." Evelyn, still unable to speak clearly, gave him a faint smile, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and pain. She was grateful for her family's support, but she also knew that she would never be the same. The life she had once known, the one filled with hope and possibilities, felt like it was slipping away. It was hard to reconcile the woman she had been with the person she was now becoming, someone scarred by violence and whose trust in the world had been shattered. While Evelyn's family focused on helping her heal, Officer Derek Thompson sat in a prison cell, grappling with the consequences of his actions. His days of wearing a badge, of feeling the weight of authority, were over. He was now just another inmate, facing the harsh reality of the life he had chosen. The life he had taken for granted. His time in prison was filled with constant reflection, but also fear. He was an officer, and now he was among the people he had once been tasked to control. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him, but it didn't change anything. He had taken a life, and now he had to pay for it. In his cell, Thompson often thought about the day that had changed everything. He remembered the fear he had felt, the split-second decision that had led him to pull the trigger. He had been trained to be decisive, to act when needed, but now he realized that the training had failed him. He hadn't been prepared for the complexities of human interaction. He had been prepared for violence, but not for the deep-seated biases that had clouded his judgment that night. He thought about Evelyn, the young woman he had shot. He didn't know her, didn't know anything about her, and yet he had taken everything from her. He would never forget the look of fear in her eyes when he approached her car. It was a moment he couldn't erase, no matter how hard he tried. Thompson was now a man marked by the mistakes of his past, a man who had fallen from grace in the eyes of the very system he had worked to protect. But while Thompson sat in his cell, life outside continued. The conversations about justice and police reform grew louder. Evelyn's case had become a symbol, not just for her, but for everyone who had suffered at the hands of a broken system. People were no longer willing to ignore the problems that had been there for so long. They were calling for change, for a rethinking of how law enforcement operated. The protests continued, but now they were shifting from anger to action. People were demanding new policies, better training, and a system that was accountable to the people it was meant to serve. For Evelyn's family, the road ahead was still uncertain. They had won the fight in court, but now they had to fight for Evelyn's future. The trauma she had experienced would take years to heal, and they knew that the journey would be difficult. But they also knew that they had come a long way. Evelyn had survived, and that alone gave them hope. They had seen the worst of humanity, the fear, the prejudice, the violence, but they had also seen the best of it, the love, the strength, and the resilience of the human spirit. Evelyn, despite everything, had shown incredible courage. She had faced a world that had turned against her, and she had not given up. Her recovery, though slow, was a reminder that there was still hope. She could still rebuild her life, even if it meant learning to live in a new reality. A reality where the past could never be erased, but where the future could still be shaped by her own choices. The public response to her case remained strong, and slowly, new initiatives began to take shape. Lawmakers started pushing for reforms, demanding changes to police training, and calling for greater oversight of law enforcement agencies. The movement that had started with Evelyn's shooting was gaining momentum, and people were no longer willing to let the status quo continue. For Evelyn, the road to healing was long, but she had her family by her side. They had been through the storm together, and they would face the future together. The verdict had been a victory, but it was just one part of a much bigger fight. The fight for justice, for change, for a world where no one else would have to suffer the way she had only just begun. And though the scars from her past would never fully fade, Evelyn had made a promise to herself. She would not let this define her. She would rebuild her life, and in doing so, she would help others rebuild theirs as well.